This is how Latino voters broke down over the last three elections. I have to say that 2024, what we have here is exit polls data. The 2016 and 2020 are more reliable. But what this means is in 2016, out of every 100 Latinos that voted, Hillary Clinton got 71 votes. And then in 2020, that dropped to 62 for Biden. And in 24, that dropped to 57 for Harris. Again, that 2024 is an approximation. But you can see that Hillary Clinton got 42 net Democratic votes out of every 100 Latino voters. That dropped to 24 for Biden, and then that dropped down to 14. This is really dramatic. We've seen shifts. There's always shifts back and forth, but to see something over three cycles is not just the country is moving in one direction. Something is happening here. So this is a really important part of the electorate. There is an expert in the country, guy named Carlos Odio, who's with us here tonight. He runs, I took down my slides. I have a slide of you, Carlos, with Equis Research, and it makes you look very official. Carlos started Equis Research. They specialize in polling and focus groups and everything dealing with Latino voters, and he's going to share some of his data and his insights with us now. Carlos?
Aaron, thank you for having me. It's so good to be on with you all. Focus for Democracy. You all do such great work. I've worked with Sandy a long time. Really appreciate the Davids and Liza and all the great work that you all do. And thank you for all the investments that you made this last cycle. Like David said, I'm going to talk about Latinos. And I will say, I think Latinos are important to study on their own. I also think Latinos are important for understanding larger trends within the electorate. Because if you want to understand change, you want to understand the volatility in the American electorate, then you got to go straight for some of the sources of volatility and not just study what never changes, but rather where things might change, because odds are they will continue changing into the future. There are two stories that we can hold about the election at the same time, and I hope that we can keep them both at the same in the same way. There's one about how Trump won the election. And I think Aaron did such a great job explaining the large shifts that really in many ways transcend demographics. You cannot tell the story of how Trump actually won the election just in demographic terms because it was so widespread. You can look at some of the larger eye-popping shifts among Latinos, for example, but if you erase those, Trump's still going to win the election, right? So how Trump won the election is one question. But regardless of 2024, and we don't want to always be fighting the last war, there were these really jaw-dropping changes among Latino voters that shocked many. We were less surprised. If you were on our presentations, maybe you were a little less surprised, but still, even there were things that surprised me. And that's worth studying. That's worth studying for what it means going into the future. I'm going to show some slides here that have a lot of numbers. I don't want anyone to fixate too much on any numbers. For those who do, you'll get the deck afterwards and you can study it. This is really about, this is impressionistic. It's really about at a high level, what can we see about the magnitude of shifts that we saw? And then how can we lay the groundwork for understanding them? Because it's important to diagnose properly if we want to prescribe properly. So first of all, Aaron already talked about this, so I'm not going to go into this, but we're limited in the kind of information that we have right now. We're depending on exit polls. I will show you here actual election results at a precinct level. Those are very noisy, so they give us a suggestion of what might happen, but it's not totally accurate. Really what we want to get, we'll know better when Catalyst and Pew release their estimates, which actually are validated voters. So they actually are looking at people that we know voted based on the administrative files from the states. But you can still back up, and this is just looking at Trump support. We're just isolating support for Trump, and we're looking at across the different kinds of estimates that we have at this point. We're looking at 2016 and 2020 and 2024, and this is just Latinos. And there are different varying estimates, right? Some more of outliers than others. But overall, the picture is of changes happening from 2016 to 2020, and then from 2020 to 2024. Now, AP Votecast and Edison exit polls and American electorate are all exit polls conducted in very different ways. The thing about exit polls, look, friends don't let friends cite exit polls. So I'm going to tell you all this for your conversations that you're having with other people. Exit polls are polls. Once upon a time, when you had somebody at a clipboard at a polling place, you got most of the voters. But since a majority of voters no longer show up at a polling place on election day anymore, what Edison exit polls have to do is call people and text them and all the other ways that pollsters do. And so it's rife with all the same errors. And those errors are compounded when you're trying to break down and look at any one subgroup of the electorate. But when we look at all the different estimates together, they can paint a wider picture. So, regardless of this, so I want to focus on two here, Edison exit polls and American electorate. The American electorate poll is the one that tends to be most liberal when it comes to Latino support levels for Republicans. So they only had Trump at 19% in 2016, okay? And yet, when you look at the exit polls, which had support at much higher, and you look at the shifts from 2016 to 2020, the magnitude of the shifts are the same. And so we don't want to get too hyper fixated on individual numbers when we talk about Latinos, because how you define Latinos influences the estimates that you're going to get. But what we care about is change. What we care about is what is changing from election to election. And we can agree on the size of the shift that we are seeing from one election to the other. Okay, so that's using polling. Now, here's the thing. Latinos are not a monolith. Equis is foremost in saying this. Since our founding in 2019, we aim to fill in gaps in understanding and engagement of Latino voters. We've been saying Latino is not a monolith. There's these major divisions within the community where really we are different communities. And you can look at things like what country someone originates from, what generation in the country they are, what language they speak at home. And these are really meaningful differences. Are they urban community, rural communities? And yet, for all of that, for 2 cycles in a row, there have been a group of people moving in their political preferences whose only commonality is that they identify as Hispanic, in spite of all these other differences we can talk about. So I'm going to show you now results pulled from precincts, cities, and counties that are heavily Latino. This is very noisy, but it's a way to isolate out as best we can areas where you have lots of Latinos, so we can say, how is this different from other areas that have fewer Latinos? And so you have a combination of cities and precincts. The precincts tend to be majority Latino precincts, what have you. This is cutting from a bunch of different states. And in the chart, what you have is change in Trump support, just Trump support from 2016 to 2020 to 2024. And in every case of all of these places that we looked at, what you're seeing is big increases. We can show in summary here from 16 to 20, from 20 to 24, and then in total from 2016 to 2024, first Trump election to the most recent Trump election, how big is the gains that Trump himself has made among Latino voters, or in heavily Latino areas, I should say. And there's a few things I want to say about this. Number one, there's a lot of debate about whether this constitutes a realignment. There's this word like thrown around. Is there a realignment of Latino support, right? Where Latinos that were once defaulting essentially to Democratic support, is that changing to something else? And I've always fought against this term for multiple reasons. Foremost is that the shifts we were seeing were always with Trump at the top of the ticket. And there's a debate about whether this is specific to Trump or not. And I'll get into that a little bit more. That's a little bit of a moot point when we have another 4 years of Trump, whether we like it or not. And so I will say, regardless of fighting over terms, this certainly looks like a realignment. It sounds like a realignment. Whatever it is, it's a big deal. To have a change like you are seeing in Philadelphia, in the heavily Latino parts of Philadelphia, Donald Trump only got 6% support in 2016. Okay, 6% support in the most Latino precincts. In 2024, it was 23%. That is a huge spike. In Lawrence, Massachusetts was the top of this list. He went from 15% support in 2016 to 41% in 2024. That is 26-point gain for Trump. Okay, in margin, it's double that. So it's 50-something percent, 52-point margin. Just that is a sizable share that is changing. Now, it's not the same people every time, right? Part of what happens with Latino electorate, it is fast growing. It churns heavily. It's not the same 10 people voting in every election. And so we might talk about a realignment, but realignments are not inevitable and they're not irreversible. Okay, especially when you have a dynamic electorate as you have with Latino voters. At the same time that the window to intervene is narrow and closing. And so there probably is not a lot of time for Democrats to stop the further sliding among this community. The second thing is I said Latino is not a monolith, but the changes are happening, cutting across the traditional divisions in the Latino community. When we try to get to the why, as I will do in literally 2 minutes, the first thing that we have to contend with is that our theories cannot be provincial. We cannot use a theory that explains how Latinos shifted in the Dominican-heavy Lawrence, Massachusetts, to explain a shift among mostly Tejano, Mexican-American, Hispanics in South Texas, in the Rio Grande Valley along the border. You can't use a theory that solely explains South Americans, Venezuelans, and Colombians shifting in Broward County, Florida, to explain shifts among Mexican Americans in Kent, Michigan, or in Milwaukee. Whatever is happening across the way among very different sets of Latinos. And so our theories have to explain and cut across the divisions as well. I will say the shift of the losses for Democrats among Latinos were worse than among other groups from everything you can tell right now. You know, if I showed you this for heavily white or black or AAPI precincts, it's bad, but not this bad. And so there is some additional thing going on with Latinos. And so while we might have theories that explain the electorate overall, we also have to explain the extra boost that Trump gets among Latinos. And that's how we approach the process of trying to explain these election results. And lastly, Aaron mentioned this, but I do want to say, there is, when you look at this, and you can break down here, you can look at Arizona, which is more toward the bottom of this list. When we look at Nevada, Las Vegas, et cetera, when we look at Philly and other parts, the shifts in the battleground states where program was actually run is not as bad as the places where it was not. So some of the worst are in Massachusetts, New Jersey, New York, California, places where program was not run. And so we can still say that program worked, even though we didn't win, right? Campaigns are not chess, where whoever plays the best game wins. It's poker, where you can play the right hand and still lose. And so we have to separate out the outcome from the steps and the processes that we took along the way. The last thing, just to this before I get into the why, for Republicans, however, I warned Democrats that the window for intervention is narrow. For Republicans, they can't assume that the gains that Trump has made will automatically translate over to every other Republican. We saw in the 2022 midterms that actually they were not able to make gains above and beyond what Trump had gotten in 2020. So 2022 in midterms were a case of stability when it came to the Latino vote. There was no further decline outside of Florida. In 2024, there were gains across the board, and Senate Republicans did better, but they did not do as well as Trump. And so here, the light red is the percent support for a Senate Republican on the ticket in that place, and the red is support for Trump. And in most places outside of Florida, which Florida is a different story that I'm happy to discuss, my hometown of Miami being some of the worst that we're seeing in the country, there is a notable difference in Latino-heavy precincts where you're seeing outright ticket splitting. People who are voting for Trump and voting for a Democrat literally on the same ballot. And we have evidence of that. Happy to discuss with anyone who wants to look at it more deeply. But again, there's still more work for Republicans as well. They cannot assume that these shifts are permanent. So with all that, I'm just going to lay out a few different ways to start this conversation, and then we're mostly going to leave the rest of the time here just for questions, because I know people have really good ones. How can we start to understand the shift? And the first thing that we have to understand is when Kamala Harris joined the race, her numbers among Latinos, the numbers among Latinos improved greatly for Democrats. Biden was getting historically bad numbers, even worse than what these results were. He was only winning Latinos in the battleground states by 5 points when it was Joe Biden on the ticket. When Kamala Harris joins the race, you see numbers that start looking more familiar, more like what you've gotten in the past, but not quite the levels of 2020. And so Kamala Harris actually did see a boost, but she didn't see all the way. And so the first and most important thing is, if we want to understand this election, you cannot understand it by studying the last 3 months. You have to study the last 4 years. Okay. Most of what happened in 2021, when Biden's job approval, which has started pretty high among Latinos, dropped precipitously and never came back up. What you're seeing in this slide is from our last pre-election poll, so it's mid-October, Equis polling. You see, we're looking at Biden job approval in mid-October, and for each category, so strongly approve on the left, what percent of people who said they strongly approved of Joe Biden were saying that they would vote for Kamala Harris, which is the blue? So of those who strongly approved of Biden, 96% said they would vote for Kamala Harris. When you go down the line and you look at the third, somewhat disapprove, those who were saying that they somewhat disapproved of Joe Biden, a majority, 56% to only 28% for Trump, were saying they would vote for Kamala Harris. That's pretty remarkable. It is pretty remarkable. It is a sign of great performance. We saw it in the 22 midterms as well. We were always tracking these somewhat disapprovers as a very swing group. People are unhappy, but really it's making them swing. It's not making them go all the way. And Kamala Harris was performing very well with them. However, she was only winning 10% of those who strongly disapproved of Joe Biden. And there were a lot of those. 38% of Latinos in the last pre-election polling strongly disapproved of Joe Biden. That is a lot to overcome. And, at the end of the day, Trump gets in the mid 40s is the best estimate that we have at this point, low to mid 40s. And so you have 38% strongly disapprove. He didn't need much more to get into those mid 40s if you're just considering Biden job approval. So Harris, throughout this, in her short term, was swimming upstream of Biden job approval. And we can see this in focus groups we did after the election with people, Latinos, who'd voted for Trump but had not voted for Trump previously. So these were new Trump voters. This was the week after the election. It was December 3rd, a few weeks after the election, I should say, sorry, a month after the election. And you have this one person, she's a 29-year-old woman, Mexican-American from Florida, saying, "It was the first time I voted for a Republican. 4 years ago, I voted for Joe Biden, believing in what he had promised, and I felt he didn't deliver on anything." But she goes on to say, "Donald Trump is not the best. He is a little racist. It hurts me because I'm Hispanic. I understand why people want to come here, but he's good at business, and that's what the country needs now." This is a sentiment we saw in 20, and we're seeing it in 24, which is that people voted for Joe Biden to end a period of crisis, thinking that we'd go back to normal. We then get buffeted with crisis after crisis, highest among them, the twin crises of migration and inflation, which rocked the entire Western world. That is not the full story, but certainly the ways that you react to that. There were choices that could be made. And voters were telling us then that they did not feel like Joe Biden was at the wheel during times when they were facing these crises that they were highly concerned about. And so even though they had concerns about Trump, they were pretty clear-eyed about Trump. They were looking back at his first term and saying, this is still a guy who I believe is good at business. And if I prioritize that, then I'm voting for Joe Biden. And you could saw this in all of our polling. It was always a tension between who cares about people like me and who do I think is better for the US economy. We ask about all kinds of attributes here. And what you see here is on the left, all Latinos, but especially swing Latinos more than other Latinos, were saying that Kamala Harris cares more about people like me and is better for Hispanics. And so if I vote on that, I'm going to vote for Kamala Harris. But if I'm voting on who I think is a stronger leader and better for the US economy, the swing voters, different from all other Latinos, gave Trump a huge advantage. That tension we saw throughout the cycle. And at the end of the day, it landed for swing Latinos on the side of strong leader, better for the US economy. Another way to look at this, we asked people what their top issue was before the election, and then we break it up by how they're telling us they're going to vote. So you look at an open-ended question, what do you think is your top issue? The height of the column here is the bar is what percent said that something was their top issue. So just over 46% said that the economy or cost of living was their top issue. Now, I want you to start though on the right here. If you look at women's rights, which also included abortion, reproductive rights, anything under the category, and next that democracy. Any voter, Latino, who was telling us that abortion or democracy was their top issue, were voting overwhelmingly for Kamala Harris. This is something that bailed out Democrats among Latinos in the 22 midterms. The thing is, it just wasn't salient enough. It wasn't top of mind. It was around 6% of Latinos who said that reproductive rights was their top issue. Just not enough to overcome what you see on the left. People who said the economy, cost, immigration, border was their top issue by huge margins. Those who said immigration or border, 46-point margin, said they were voting for Donald Trump. Among those who said the economy, which is a top issue, it was a 4-point edge for Donald Trump. And so huge advantages on abortion, democracy couldn't overcome this huge hole in which Democrats, Biden and Harris faced at the end of this cycle. And then the last thing, one of the last two things here I want to say, as I said, we have to explain Latinos. We have to explain how it is that such different groups of voters, who in other ways don't have much in common, still found themselves shifting in equal proportion, in extent more to others. And so where you have to start is with social dynamics and social networks, because there is a kind of force field in place. If you want to understand why Latinos are moving, we have to understand the past, why they hadn't moved previously to Republicans. How is it that you had people who identified as conservative and were Latino, and yet still were not supporting Republican to the extent you'd expect a conservative to? And a big part of the answer is that there was this identity force field where it was deemed socially unacceptable to vote for Republicans or Trump. In 2020, that gets broken. COVID scrambled a lot of things in ways that we can elaborate on. But coming out of COVID, it scrambled people's priorities where they were willing to say, as the last focus group participant said, yeah, he's racist, but economy. Now, that created a permission structure where in the past, if you were disgruntled with Democrats, you would either hold your nose and vote for them, or you would just stay home. All of a sudden, if you were disgruntled, voting for Trump becomes a viable option, at least from a social perspective. So one thing we asked people in the last pre-election poll is, how are people in your social network, the people you interact with regularly, voting? Your family, your coworkers, your friends. This is just among people who told us they voted for Joe Biden in 2020 on this slide. Latinos who voted for Joe Biden in 2020. If you told us that you voted for Joe Biden in 2020 and that most of the people you interact with were voting for Kamala Harris, you were voting for Kamala Harris. But if you interacted with people who were voting for Donald Trump, you were much more likely to defect. This is Biden voters, people who voted for Joe Biden. If you said that the people around you were mostly Trump voters, then a plurality of them were saying that they were going to vote for Donald Trump. They followed where the group went. So group dynamics help explain a lot of this. If you want to look at this from the reverse direction, you can look at people who liked Donald Trump, what a favorable opinion of Donald Trump. But if they mostly interacted with Harris voters, then 45% of them were sticking with Kamala Harris. Okay. People take their cues from others, especially when they themselves are not strongly partisan. I've gone over time, so I'm not going to go into immigration, but if we need to, we can get into the Q&A. It is obviously a very big part of the story. We get asked all the time, how is it people can vote for Donald Trump in spite of mass deportation and whatnot? It's a long story, but I just want to give you a very short one here, which is this person who told us after the election, there were more deportations under Obama than under Trump. The advantage that Democrats once had on immigration disappeared over the last several years. It used to help, and it was never the number one issue among Latinos, but it helped draw a line in the sand. And a lot of what voters were telling was, we would vote for Democrats because they promised big things, but they wouldn't deliver. And then Republicans would say they do bad things, but they didn't do them either. So why should I vote on immigration at all? And so immigration basically got pushed aside as an issue. This is someone who, 22-year-old from Georgia, Mexican-American, both his parents are undocumented. And he felt like they were lied to. They were told they were going to get a pathway to citizenship. Now, he doesn't believe that Donald Trump's going to deport his parents. People did not believe that Donald Trump's mass deportation plans were about undocumented immigrants who'd been here a long time. They thought that deportation referred to people who'd recently crossed the border or who had committed crimes. People to this day still believe that Donald Trump is not going to touch undocumented immigrants who've been here a long time and not commit any crimes. That is a prevalent thought, and there are rational reasons that people hold that view. And unfortunately, Kamala Harris and Democrats did nothing to disabuse people of that notion of what mass deportation meant. So we can get more into it if people are interested in it, but just to say, there are rational reasons that we can understand of why it wasn't because of deportations of undocumented immigrants that people supported Trump, but in spite of them, although there was high support for taking care of the border as a law and order and security issue. So I'm going to stop there so that we have time to get to questions, because I'm sure they have been piling up. Oh, there are 38 questions in the Q&A.
Oh, I'm sure we've got lots of them and lots of great questions. Carlos, even though I had the opportunity to spend some time with you prior to this, asking you tons of questions, so many come up as I listen to you speak. But I'm going to threw out one of my hypotheses that I shared with you earlier, which is that we give Latinos a category. Um, but what we've seen with immigrant communities over time, they come to America, they have this identity, but over time they identify as Americans and they integrate. Is that what's happening with Latinos? Latinos are heavily working class, and are they just starting to vote like working class Americans or white working class Americans as an
Yeah.
equal, you know?
Look, I think it's obviously, I think that is the question. I think that's a central question here. When we talk about how Latinos became Democrats to begin with, it's a combination of ethnicity and class. So class concerns, ethnic concerns kind of converged, where the sense was Democrats are better for me as a working person, as a Latino, as a minority. Now you've seen a little bit of those diverge, right? Where the sense is maybe the Latinos still belong with Democrats, even though that's softening, but that as a working person, my interests are no longer represented there. And so people are more cross-pressured. They haven't been fully convinced, but they're certainly feeling it on all sides. Now, assimilation, acculturation is a thing we think about all the time. It's hard to look at because, excuse me, if it's happening, you're early in the process. But yeah, you can look at the experience of Irish, Italian, other ethnic whites, Polish, German, and say, okay, over time, people will just become part of the broader American electorate. And that might happen with Latinos. But there are reasons to wonder. If you look at New Mexico and parts of Colorado, you have a lot of people who identify as Spanish. They will tell you they're Spanish. But if pushed, they're also Hispanic or Hispano or something along those lines. There are people like my co-founder, Stephanie Valencia, whose family's been in this country 13 generations, who will say, we didn't cross the border crossed us. We were Americans before there was an America. And they still, in spite of all other demographics that would point them to being in one party, still end up being Democrats. There's still something that makes them different from their neighbors. And I think it's important to understand something like a Latino identity, not as some biological trait, right? But rather, American society is a little bit like a high school cafeteria, where you walk in, and the way America has always organized itself is like binary. There's like the black table and the white table. And if you're Latino, which table do you sit at? And so what ends up happening is Latinos sit at the table with the other people who seem to be like them. They aren't exactly identical, but they speak Spanish. And most importantly, it seems like other people place them in those buckets. It's a common story if you grow up in Miami, like I did, that you grow up in Miami and you don't think of yourself as Latino. You think of yourself as Colombian or Cuban or Dominican or wherever you come from. But then you move somewhere else and then you realize, oh no, I'm Latino. Because that's how other people see me. And so people come to understand that in politics, a politician and a party, when it comes time to make decisions, who are they thinking of people like me as? And people come to understand they're thinking of people like me as the people sitting at the Latino table. And so you think, okay, which party cares about people like me is going to take me into consideration when it comes time to make decisions. So that hasn't fully disappeared, but that's the thing we're monitoring, has the sense of which party Latinos belong with. Is that going to change further? How much is it just about Trump? Or is there truly a change in the hardwired party associations that come that when you are raised Latino in this country?
Well, that brings me to another question I have, but I'm going to defer to some other questions that have been coming in. So, is Julia here?
Hey, hi Carlos, thanks. So yeah, we have
Um,
a question. I first wanted to call on Meg Holmberg. She had a question. If Yeah, Meg, you should be able to unmute yourself now. And for folks who raise their hand, if you could put your question to chat, I appreciate that instead of raising your hand.
Meg, are
Sorry,
you
I'm
there?
still finding my question here. Let's see. I think you answered my first question, but another one is, are there gender differences in the rightward shift among Latinos?
Meg, that is a great question. And, obviously Latino men, like all men, are more Trump supporting than the women. There is a healthy gender divide. It doesn't mean the women aren't shifting too. There are many women, especially women in the middle. So women in their 30s and 40s who identify as middle class, maybe recently parents. There's a class of Latino women who have been shifting. At the same time, the biggest gender divide is among the youngest Latinos. Latinos under 30 is where you see a massive divide. And Latinos who very likely shifted the most are men under 30.
Wow.
It's a whole different reality that they're operating in at this juncture.
I saw some of your pre-election data on that, Carlos, and it was just mind-blowing. The gender divide among the young.
Do
Do you think that came to pass in the election?
Yeah, I think it probably held up fairly well. And just their views of the candidates was just fundamentally different. When you ask the strong leader question, who's a strong leader? It's like a 40-point difference between young men and young women on who would be a strong leader, where the men think Trump's a strong leader and the women think Harris would be a strong leader. They're just viewing things in a fundamentally different way. This isn't just about an issue or a set of issues. This is a cultural divide. People operating in an entirely different reality. And young men are certainly operating in that very different reality.
Yeah. Julia?
Yep. A question from Ricky Gandhi. Ricky? Let's see. You can go ahead and go ahead, Ricky.
Hello. So I was curious about the divide between like well-informed or the voters who pay attention versus not. Like I've seen a lot of research showing that those who are a lot more well-informed tended to overwhelmingly support Harris versus Trump. And I'm wondering if we see that similar thing happen with the Latino population.
So, Ricky, great question. Absolutely. Like that is a big divide here, right? You saw in 2020 that Trump made his biggest gains among what you call low propensity Latinos. So Latinos least likely to vote. But we've had now two high turnout elections. And so as those Latinos come to the electorate, they are very swing. We think of Latinos who don't vote very often as, I think at some point people got the impression, oh, we just got to get all Latinos to vote, and like little Duracell rabbits, they're going to all like march into the polls and vote for Democrats. When in reality, the very things that kept them on the sidelines of voting keep them on the sidelines of the parties. They're just less partisan. They're swing. They're fundamentally swing voters. And the swing voters have been shifting toward Trump. Trump and the snapshot of Trump as this businessman, an outsider who shakes things up, doesn't do things the normal way, prioritizes the economy above everything else, is a fighter. That snapshot is so enduring. Like it was the first thing people said about Donald Trump when he started running in 2016 after they laughed. They would laugh and they'd say, outsider businessman is going to shake things up. That's never changed. And among a lower information voter who doesn't pay close attention to politics, that's just never been buffeted. And in fact, I just mentioned the stat about about young men who thought Trump would be a stronger leader. I was trying to see like, well, what media do they consume, right? And the big difference is not, these people consume YouTube and these people consume podcasts. It's actually that there are certain voters who just aren't getting news at all. And the people who weren't watching TikTok and weren't getting news from YouTube were just riding with the snapshot that they had previously, the impressions they had of the first term. So yes, that is a very big dynamic. We're going to have more data on that from a new poll that we just came out of the field. But I'd say that's a very, very big element of this.
Thanks, Carlos. Julia?
Yeah, I'm going to call on Janet Kodish. Janet, you can unmute yourself.
Am I unmuted?
Yep.
Okay. Yeah, I'm curious. I've been learning a lot about the role of evangelical Christianity in the broader electorate, and I'm wondering what role it has to play in this shift among Latino voters.
So it's an interesting question because, yes, evangelical Latinos tend to be Republicans, but that's always been the case. And so while you have had some growth, the growth in evangelism among Latinos does not explain the full shift. So it's like in the mix. But if you were evangelical, you were already Republican. So it doesn't fully explain the additional gains that we're seeing, even though it's clearly a part of what has created kind of a Republican base among Latinos. But it doesn't explain the changes.
Julia, while you're
Uh,
queuing up the next person, I'm going to ask Carlos one of my questions, which is you make the point that once it becomes acceptable to vote for a Republican, it becomes more acceptable. And
Yeah.
then there's a permission structure. And that seems like a reinforcing cycle that are we now at a place where the taboo to vote for Republicans among Latinos is never going back?
I would certainly say that's the fear. I think that's certainly the fear. It's hard to put back, you know. The headlines are self-fulfilling. Actually, there's been studies. You show someone a headline that said Latinos are voting for Democrats in historic numbers, and it makes someone more likely to vote for Democrats. If you have a headline that says Latinos are more likely to vote for are voting for Republicans, it makes them more likely to vote for Republicans. Well, guess what? All the headlines have been. And so all of the idea of it being taboo is entirely out the window. I think the trend line is very pessimistic for Democrats. But even if you believe in realignment, there's going to be this middle period that Democrats are going to muddle through, where there's still going to be the opportunity to win enough Latino voters to keep the coalition together and win elections. That's what happened in 2022. That's still going to be very possible in a 2026. And so there are larger trends, but I don't want people to think that those longer trends mean that in the short term, this vote is entirely gone, even if there are reasons to be worried about what things are going to look like certainly in 10 years.
Yeah, I mean, the point is Latino voters overall voted more for Harris than Trump. We're looking at this shift and we're thinking of them as Trump voters, but that's not the case.
No, a majority still voted for Harris.
Right.
Even a majority of men in most states. Overall, it's probably it's closer to 50-50. But even then, there are many states where Democrats still enjoy majority support. And in fact, if it weren't for that majority support, Democrats would just still never win in those states. That's just how the math works. Even in a state where Latinos are only 3 or 4% of the electorate, if you don't win a majority of them, you ain't going to win the state. We don't get enough support Democrats don't get enough support among white voters. That's just how the math works. And that's still possible. That's very much still possible, even even with the dynamics that we're talking about right now and the possible changes. The other thing is Latinos are very young. Latinos are coming into the electorate all the time. And part of how Trump has made his gains is that those Latinos were coming into the electorate when Biden was president. And with Trump doing his thing in the background, we're joining at a point where Latinos were becoming more Republican. And so you have incredible Trump support among these newer voters that I wouldn't assume happens with every tranche of new voters going forward. There are still opportunities, which is why I continue to be a big believer in voter registration and the importance of voter registration going forward. Because if you talk about shaping the electorate, so much of it's about young people. It's about new voters, naturalized citizens, and certainly I would think first and foremost about Latinos when it comes to that. So certainly don't keep fighting the last war. Assume that you're talking about the same people every time out.
Great. Julia?
Carol Chetkovich had a question. Go ahead, Carol. You can unmute yourself.
Thank you. Thanks. I've been struggling to figure out how to enter the Q&A. It strikes me, and perhaps I'm wrong in thinking about it this way, but it strikes me that from the quotes that you shared about why a Latino voter would have voted for Trump, even though he or she might recognize his racism and other undesirable qualities, they thought they were upset because the Democrats had failed them on immigration and, they felt lied to, and also because of the economy. Well, my feeling is the Democrats have not been able to do something on immigration because they cannot get the Republicans on board with it. So what the F what's the message in a situation like that? And the same thing with respect to the economy. I do understand that, we often measure the health of the economy in ways that don't accurately reflect what everyone's experience is. But even so, if you look at measures of the economy under Joe Biden, especially if you look at the effing unemployment rate, it has been phenomenal. Why are people not seeing that?
Yeah, thank you,
Carol,
Carol.
we needed you out there with those effing this and effing that to get that message across.
Yeah, absolutely. Look, it's such a great question. And I just, I think it's important not to walk past all the great successes of the Biden administration, but also, look, again, every incumbent in the Western world who presided over this period of inflation paid some kind of penalty. They didn't all lose, but they paid some kind of penalty. It's the economy, but the economy is never just the economy. The economy is cultural. People are saying, who is fighting for people like me, who understands what I am going through, who understands how I think about things. And COVID really scrambled things for people because the impression coming out of COVID was that Donald Trump cared about the economy above absolutely everything else, including human life. And for a certain kind of Latino, we're not talking about all Latinos, guys. We're talking like a sliver of Latinos who are swing Latinos, who are more conservative when it comes to the economy, who are saying, yes, the reason I am in this country to begin with, the reason I'm in this country to begin with, my family's in this country to begin with, is to provide for them. Is because I put the economy above everything else. So when I vote, that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to put economic concerns above everything else and vote for the candidate who I think shares my values on this. It's not about accomplishments. We also can't dismiss Biden's age when it comes to this. It became like a taboo subject, but like it was just every focus group. I mean, we were all trying to be polite about it, but when you go into a focus group, the first thing people would say is he's old, and that was it. And they would say, I didn't like Donald Trump, and I didn't agree with everything he did, but I knew that every day he was doing things. And with Joe Biden, I just never see him. I don't know that he's working.
Yeah.
This is how people make decisions. It's not always the most rational way to do things. And yet they didn't like the lack of presence from the Biden administration the first 2 years. If we're honest, the Biden White House tried to pretend that high prices weren't happening until it was too late. The migration crisis, a lot of my friends were very responsible for saying, oh no, there's no crisis at all, when very clearly people with their eyes could see that there was massive inflows of people and it just seemed like disorder. And the Biden White House was not leaning into it. They were hoping the issue would go away. And so the impression was, well, they just don't care. They're not going to solve anything. And that was hard to shake going forward. A lot of this was baked in by 2022.
I'll just add one other thing, which is that we tend to talk about the economy, but what people were focused on was the cost of living. They were focused on their grocery prices and their gas prices rather than on bigger things like unemployment. And if you think about it, even though we know what unemployment does to people is horrendous, it's a relatively small number of people, whereas the cost of groceries affects everybody.
Everybody.
Yeah.
And so that's
how
what
was
we
the other
were
one?
up against.
Sandy, you always say it well. It's about making ends meet. And a part of that is I go to the grocery store and it costs a lot more. I can buy less meat. That's what people would say in focus groups. I can buy less meat today than I could before. That's a hard reality to overcome. And then housing was a really big one. Housing affordability, both in what they were facing month to month in terms of utilities and rent, but also you had people coming into their 30s and saying, I'm never going to be able to buy a house. A thing that we have built up to be part of the American dream, and people saying, I just will never be able to own this part of the dream. Because post-COVID, housing prices skyrocketed in the way they did.
Yeah. Thanks. Good point, Sandy. So we're right at approaching the top of the hour. I know there are probably tons of great questions, and I have tons for you, Carlos. I think we're going to have to come back once you get granular data on who voted and all of that, because I think there are more answers out there. But I wanted to just give you an opportunity to share maybe some of the other stuff that Equis has done. You guys had moonshot programs you were looking at. I don't know if there's anything you want to share with this network.
Yeah, I appreciate that, Aaron. Yeah, I mean, research is at the core of what we do is research informed, but it's not research for its own sake. What we try to do is tell stories about Latinos that help actually then change how engagement happens. And so we've seeded some of those things ourselves in what we call the moonshots, which were gaps in the ecosystem that required an order of magnitude more funding or sophistication. So my co-founder, Stephanie, went and bought 17 Spanish language radio stations. We started a media company called Lunario that focuses on YouTube, because YouTube is actually the #1 source of news for Latinos. Latinos don't just go there to watch music videos and makeup tutorials, but to get news, to understand what is happening in the world. And it's largely the right who is shaping people's worldview in an ongoing basis in something like there. But also it's about doing field experiments. It's also about influencing culture, because so much of politics is downstream of culture. And so we work with a broad set of players across sectors who are interested in the Latino question to help them do a better job. Some of that we're taking on ourselves, but a lot of it is just about helping other people understand this, because it affects all the work that we do. And frankly, a lot of the lessons that you can look at Latinos apply to other groups as well.
Absolutely.
Very fast changing electorate.
Absolutely. And we followed your moonshot programs, and buying up radio stations is all really important and fascinating stuff. And as I was talking at the top of the hour about where we're looking at larger infrastructure, things that can be done with a longer time horizon. I want to make sure that I plug our event that's next week for the Wisconsin Supreme Court. We'll have Ben Wickler with us. We actually had a briefing earlier today with Ben Wickler and Judge Crawford for donor advisors. It's a really important election. So please join us, everybody, next time. Carlos, we'll have to have you back, because there's so many questions and many answers, and really appreciate you sharing and all the work you're doing.
Thanks for having me on. If you're one of the 99 people who asked the question and wasn't answered, yes, we can make another time, or feel free to come ask. We're always happy to talk about this. This is why we exist as a resource. Happy to share my email, carlos@equislabs.us, and we'll share a deck with everything I presented here, and folks can follow up with the contact information in there as well.
Awesome. Well, everybody, it's unusual that I end a call without asking people to give, but tonight we're going to do it. Next time we'll be together to do some of that. I really appreciate everybody joining. This is an incredibly difficult moment, and we need to stick together as a community. So it's so great to see everybody, and looking forward to seeing you guys soon. So good night, all.